on Sunday afternoon. Interim payments will be made to victims of the infected blood scandal who are most unwell within the next 90 days. The Cabinet Office ministers told MPs the government recognises time is of the essence, with £210,000 handed out initially. And Chelsea boss Mauricio Pochettino has left the club by mutual consent. The Argentinian led them to a sixth-place finish in the Premier League. In the City, the FTSE 100 has closed down 7 points at 84.16. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17. LBC weather: heavy rain for eastern, central and northwest England tonight, as well as parts of Wales and southern Scotland. A low of 7 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, welcome to the programme. The reason I'm laughing, for those of you listening at home, is that we just caught Corey on camera crawling across the floor. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Cross Question. We have with us in the studio, sitting to my left, Caroline Lucas, Green Party MP for Brighton Pavilion and former leader of the Green Party. Next to her is the Reverend Steve Chalke, who's founder of the Oasis Charitable Trust, which works to tackle homelessness and human trafficking, and also runs more than 50 schools across England. He's also a Baptist church minister. To my right, Heather Wheeler, Conservative MP for South Derbyshire. And next to her is Salmond, leader of the Alba Party and former First Minister of Scotland and former leader of the SNP. So, lots to talk about tonight, lots in the news this week. The number for your questions, 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on the same number, text 84850, or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And please do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, our first call is from Chris in Stubbington. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ian. Should Lord Ken Clarke, former Health Secretary, be stripped of his peerage after a bloody inquiry concluded he has misled the public and rebuked him for his combative style when he gave evidence to the inquiry?
Now, the infected blood inquiry report was highly critical of the Conservative peer and former Health Secretary, accusing him of misleading the public about the risks posed by blood transfusions. The inquiry's chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, said Lord Clarke's words gave false reassurance to people. Now, he was Health Minister, I think, for several years in the 1980s and then became Health Secretary, so he was at the core of what went on. And I have to say, when I watched some of the evidence that he gave to the inquiry, I thought it was verging on the flippant. Alex Salmond.
Well, certainly, Ken Clarke didn't do himself any favours with his insouciance at the inquiry and the manner in which he treated it as if he was in the House of Commons and the rest of it. I'd have to say that if Ken Clarke was to be punished or stripped of his peerage, then you'd have to do something to just about every health minister and every prime minister for the last 40 years. Maybe that's no bad thing, and I've certainly called for that for one or two of them for other reasons. But the whole sorry tale has been one of people ducking responsibility, refusing to face up to the issue, and refusing to do what should have been done. I congratulate Sir Brian Langstaff. I set up the inquiry in Scotland, and it didn't have the same success in getting to the bottom of the issue, partly because, of course, there was no cooperation from the government down here. They refused to cooperate. We know from documents. Why? Well, because he didn't want the inquiry to spread south. Lord Penrose, I think, came up against obstacles. He didn't have the powers to compel witnesses and documents from down here. We've seen government briefings to say to MPs, why there shouldn't be an English inquiry to match the Scottish inquiry. But again, I'm not incidentally saying that the Health Department of Scotland are blameless. On the contrary, I think they had the same attitude of say nothing, admit nothing, admit no liability. And so my first thing is to congratulate Brian Langstaff in getting to the bottom of it. I think a lot of ex-ministers should hang their heads in shame. the only reason I wouldn't say that Ken Clarke should be singled out for punishment is actually he's the one that came to the inquiry to defend his position. He defended the indefensible, but if you punished him, you'd have to punish every health secretary and every prime minister for the last 40 years.
Let me play devil's advocate, because you must have had occasions as First Minister where you had made a decision on the basis of the evidence provided to you by your civil servants, and then later come to regret it because that advice turned out to be wrong, erroneous, ill-judged, whatever. But the buck still had to stop with you because you were at the top of the political tree. Now, over a number of decades, certainly in the Thatcher and Major governments this happened, but then of course Tony Blair also. I mean, he refused to have an inquiry about, I think, 2001, something like that.
I can also tell you that the Brown government were not delighted that I went ahead with the public inquiry in Scotland. On the contrary, they were spitting, I was going to say spitting blood, but that'd been
but it's also a bit like Ed Davey being blamed for a lot of the post office scandal, where he was post office minister. He was reassured by his officials that...
stopped, but nonetheless, the tradition, as you rightly say, is that ministers take responsibility and civil servants get off with it. The point I'm making about Ken Clarke, who I've got a huge soft spot for, because we all find his attitude refreshing at times. He was ill-judged in saying what he said at the inquiry because it didn't seem to take into account the extent of the suffering and the impact on 30,000 people, of course 3,000 of whom are now dead, and what they've had to endure over the last 40 years. But the culture of secrecy wasn't specific to England. It was there in Scotland as well. The one thing I can say is at least the Scottish Government back in 2007 decided to set up an inquiry and try to do something about it. But it's Sir Brian Langstaff who's nailed it and has absolutely, with the powers he had...
But to answer the question, should Ken Clarke have his peerage removed?
No, because you'd have to do it to everyone else, and you can't single out one person when so many are guilty.
Caroline Lucas.
Well, I certainly think heads need to roll. I think there needs to be accountability, and I think that needs to be seen by the victims of this horrendous scandal. So the individual question of Ken Clarke, I haven't read enough of the report to know how fair it is to single him out, to know how much he was simply going on what he was told, and whether there were moments when he really should have known what was going on and yet didn't come clean when he gave his evidence. So I feel I don't yet know enough about his particular culpability. But in principle, if there was something that suggested that he was particularly culpable and knew things that he didn't admit to knowing, then I would have absolutely no hesitation at all in saying that his peerage should be removed. I think we've had this culture for far too long when people simply are able to shrug and get away with stuff. And when we've got just so many scandals of this kind that have happened in recent years, whether that's Hillsborough, whether it's the post office scandal or this, there are big cultural systemic issues that need to be addressed within Westminster, within Whitehall. Some of that we discussed today in the debate around things like a legal duty of candour on absolutely everyone involved in public bodies and in government and so forth. That's positive going forward. But I still think that those people who have fought for 40 or even 50 years sometimes to try to get justice on this would want to see some kind of justice being done for people who have lied and got away with it in the past. And if that means a peerage going, then so be it.
Isn't the problem in situations like this that it's often deputy heads that roll rather than the people at the top of the tree?
That's a political choice, isn't it? So if we can demonstrate, and as I say, obviously it's 7 volumes, I haven't read all of it, but if there's sufficient evidence in Sir Brian's report to suggest that heads at the top of the tree should go, then they should.
Heather Wheeler.
Yeah, this is all a really, really difficult case, isn't it? And my heart goes out to all of the families involved. And what I found really fascinating about the people that had taken the blood, were given it by the doctors in good faith, it's a classless crime. People, very rich people got it, very poor people got it. There isn't anything that's specific about an area or a geography area or anything like that. It was just horrendous right the way across the board. I'd forgotten that Anita Roddick had died from it. Just astonishing, the people that had got involved. So getting back to the point, Ken Clarke in every job he ever took on was just one of those very bullish guys. And I don't know that he ever had any doubts in his life about anything. And so when you bring that to the political field, you just bat everything away with that mindset.
He had doubts about Mrs. Thatcher.
No, I'm not going to say why that is. Okay. Do you know what? He was wrong. There you go. So I can say that about Ken Clarke. He was wrong about Mrs. T. So,
But to say, well, he was bullish and didn't have self-doubt about anything, well, fair enough. But the point here is that it was known for some time that the blood that was being imported from America, from predominantly from American prisons, was infected, and yet and it wasn't. I mean, I don't actually necessarily blame the politicians here. You have to blame the people who advised the politicians that this was okay.
Yeah, I agree.
And I don't know if any of you were listening to this, but I heard on the Today programme about 3 or 4 weeks ago, a professor of epidemiology, was it? Something like that, who seemed to still stand by the original decisions. And I'm thinking, am I hearing this correctly?
I should clarify. I'm not here to defend Ken Clarke, but nonetheless, his claim at the inquiry was the decision wasn't made at his level. And the claim against him was, but you said there is no evidence, or there's no conclusive evidence, or something like that. But that in itself is just what was said by his predecessors as Health Secretary and his successors as Health Secretary. Now, in Scotland, the charge is somewhat different. Scotland didn't import the material from America because Scotland was self-sufficient in blood supplies. But what the Scottish Health Service did was they continued to take blood from prisoners after it was known that the prison population was heavily infected with drug-related blood conditions. And there was a delay. It's difficult to estimate how much, but perhaps a year, perhaps 2 years. So the Scottish victims were, in the main, self-infected, apart from the children at York Hill Hospital, where the blood was imported for a specific reason about paediatric care for children with leukemia. So this failure to report or to own up, and this desperate wish to conceal things afterwards was systemic through the civil service. I suppose what you could say about ministers, if they didn't know, they should have known. But even after it was known that these things had been wrong, there was resistance against this public inquiry. And although Penrose in Scotland didn't get to the bottom of what Longstaff had done, at least it had the effect, of course, that when Penrose reported back in 2015, that's when David Cameron made the apology. Steve Charles was coming.
Well, I think two things. So I sit outside of Parliament, unlike
at the moment, Steve.
and the reality is that I lead a large organisation that works with several departments of government, and the culture of cover-up, of not accepting liability, of shifting the blame, of not being the guy that gets holding the parcel when the music stops. And it's driven by our increasingly our society that is increasingly absolutely scared of accepting liability for anything. So what I'd say is behind Whitehall and civil servants I work alongside sit a whole bunch of lawyers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the lawyers are employed to make sure that you've not got your name on anything and you can shift the blame. And it is a cover-up culture that exists in our system. It's been there for a long time. But the other thing I want to say is that Perry Evans, whose wife, Heather, has been in the news today. I've seen her on the television, heard her on the radio. Perry died 5 weeks ago. I've known Perry for 35 years. Heather worked for Oasis, the organisation I began, for many years until she left us to nurse Perry in the last couple of years of his life. But then he succeeded and he lived through it and he lived through it and he lived through it. But 5 weeks ago, yesterday, he died. And what we mustn't forget is the human tragedy of lawyers who exist simply to make sure that the blame never stops with the guy they're responsible.
And we should also not forget that every week two victims of this scandal die.
Yeah.
And so any more further delay in the compensation, of course the procedure for that was outlined in the Commons today, will be disastrous for that many families.
And I heard Heather interviewed on the Today programme on BBC, if I can mention them here this morning. And she was asked the question by the presenter, and it was, do you have faith that this compensation package will actually be paid out in good measure, hastily? And she said, we've been promised and promised and promised, and I'm still not sure.
Caroline?
Well, I was going to say, I think John Glenn did a good job this afternoon. I believe he will do his best, but I think it's interesting that even this government, who appeared to be taking this more seriously, had an opportunity a year ago when the second interim report was published last April, and a number of us at the time were saying, set up the compensation scheme now. And even still, this government wouldn't do it then. So although 1 year, after 40 years or 50 years, doesn't seem so much, as you say, given that every single day people are still dying, then lives could have been saved even in this last year, even with the same ministers we've got right now, if they had acted faster.
Yeah, I don't think that's quite fair. And thank you for saying John Glenn's done a good job, because he has done an absolutely amazing job. He's put his heart and soul into this. Yeah. So the point is, he's got the support of the Chancellor of the Exchequer to do it. So please don't forget that
why wasn't it done a year ago?
Hold on. Some money has already been paid out. Some of the 100,000s have already been paid out. So others will get, within 90 days, 100,000 as a down payment. And the people that have previously had 100,000 will be able to have the appropriate top-ups.
All true, but it could have been done.
No,
it could have been done a year ago.
No. You've got to do it by the law.
There was an interim report where Sir Brian was asking for it to be done a year ago.
Well, I think money coming out in 90 days for this government, for any government, is hugely impressive.
When there's the political will,
and have me back on in 90 days.
Really quickly.
No. 90 days is a huge forward movement.
But you can put legislation through in a day if you want to.
Yeah, well, it's been done.
You can, but you've got to do the back office stuff.
Less good reason. But
very quickly,
reflect on the resolve, the dignity, the endurance of the campaigners.
Absolutely.
But secondly, I'm going to say once again about Langstaff. Finally, somebody's been in charge of a public inquiry. He's seized it and he's taken it to
and
the
he got a standing ovation from the victims. Have you ever seen that happen before?
Incredible. Yeah. No. Incredible.
It was
well, on that high note, let's move on to another subject in a couple of moments' time. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Info. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 8:20 on LBC. Caroline Lucas from the Green Party, Alex Salmond, leader of the Alba Party. Have I pronounced that right? I think I've got it now, haven't I?
Better and better.
Thank goodness for that. Heather Wheeler, Conservative MP for South Derbyshire, and the Reverend Stephen Chalke, founder of the Oasis Charitable Trust. They're all with us taking your calls. Here's another one from David in Brighton. Hello, David.
Hi. Yes, my question is, in some ways linked to the previous question, and also Lord Wolney's report that came out today. And he said at the end of it that people should rely on our great country's parliamentary democracy and institutions for change rather than taking direct action. I think in the context he was talking of climate activists. And I was thinking, is there an irony around the blood scandal victims who trusted our parliamentary democracy and nothing happened for 40 years? And will there be an inquiry in 30 years, 40 years about our response to climate change? So the irony struck me, and I'm interested to know what people feel about when direct action is reasonable and when we should, as Lord Wolney said, sit back and trust the politicians. It was also mentioned Lord Wolney's connection with the fossil industry, and he said that's been declared and is fine, but the word independent troubles me a bit. So it's really just the irony around the post office workers, the blood victims who trusted the system and nothing happened. Others who want to take direct action seem to be under threat. Just the timing struck me as ironic, so I'd be interested in their views.
OK, David, thank you for that. Now, John Woodcock, or Lord Wolney, as he is now known, he's the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption. He said that police need to be robust against protest groups like Just Stop Oil. He said such organisations should be seeking to have their goals met through parliamentary democracy rather than what he believes are intimidating and sometimes illegal demonstrations. Now, Caroline Lucas, you've done the odd bit of direct action in the past, haven't you?
I'm proud of it. And actually, when I protested outside the fracking site in Bolcombe, I was arrested and was put on trial and was acquitted after a week's trial. And I'm proud to say I think that action, alongside actions of many others, was instrumental in changing the government's position about fracking. So I think there is a role in our society for peaceful direct action. And I was really struck when Lord Wolney was setting out his case today, when one of the journalists said, well, what would that mean for the suffragettes, let's say, or the anti-apartheid campaigners, or gay pride people kissing at a time when that wasn't supposed to be done in public and so forth. And he said, oh, well, don't worry, because we now have parliamentary democracy, so we don't need to have any of this peaceful protest lark. Well, I mean, I think that just misunderstands the purpose and process of peaceful protest, and I think David's got quite a point when he talks about the 40 or 50 years that the infected blood scandal victims were waiting for. But it's also the case that our democracy doesn't actually, in this country, work all that well. I mean, we regularly have governments elected on a minority. We don't have proportional representation, so you can't even say that even if you did think that democracy just meant voting once every 5 years, which I don't, I think it's something rather more engaged than that, but even if you did think that, then for loads of people live in safe seats all around the country where they know that barring a revolution, the same party is going to get in again and again. So people feel disenfranchised and don't feel as if that process is working well enough. The climate crisis is the existential threat of our time. And I was just really struck as well that on this very same day that Lord Wolney is trying to clamp down yet further on peaceful protest in a report that is dangerous, it's draconian, it's undemocratic. At the same time, we had the High Court ruling in favour of Liberty, who brought a case to the High Court when they were challenging the government on defining serious disruption as being more than minor, which is a pretty rubbish definition of serious. And so what we've seen is that just today the High Court has ruled the government's crackdown on protest as unlawful. And yet Lord Wolney is coming out with all of these extra things he would like to see cracked down upon. And he didn't say in his report that he's a paid advisor to the Purpose Business Coalition, whose members include BP. He didn't say he's a paid advisor to the lobbyist Rudd Pedersen, whose clients include the fossil fuel giant Glencore. I raised a point of order in Parliament today, which sounds like a very abstruse mechanism, and it is rather, but essentially this report was introduced into Parliament today using a provision which essentially allows it to be protected from any kind of legal challenge. And so essentially we are giving parliamentary privilege and protection to this report from somebody who didn't even think it was relevant to include in the front of the report that he's being paid by some of the people who he wants to protect from peaceful protests. So the whole thing stinks, quite frankly.
Steve Chalke.
I think that all protest is disruptive.
Of course
That's
it is.
what it's designed
That's what
to
it's
be.
for.
But all protest...
But Caroline's protest in West Sussex 11 years ago, that would have been disruptive for a limited period of time. But some of the protests that are carried out in London now by Just Stop Oil, to use one example, they are majorly disruptive.
Disruption is a good thing. If people are angry, if there's no way of expressing that anger or that fear, what kind of society are we? We become a police state. This isn't talking about violence. It's my freedom always ends at the beginning of your nose, doesn't it? I have freedom to express myself. I have freedom to express myself, but not to hurt you. Yeah. Not to disrespect you. So, as Caroline
says... But it does
says,
hurt me if my mother's in an ambulance and can't get to hospital.
Of course it does. And that's why, in my belief, the police need to work with those who want to protest. We should celebrate the fact that we are a democracy where you can speak out in freedom, where we're not a police state and we're not Russia. When we see this on the TV, we go, no, these states behave like this. If we go down that road, we're lost. Okay. So Gandhi, so Martin Luther King, so Emmeline Pankhurst, etc., all of this is important. What really got my goat today, actually, is Michael Gove, who seemed to think this was all brilliant. You know, it's all... that attitude stirs up anger. That doesn't help reduce attention in our society. It creates it.
Here's Heather Wheeler to stir up a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, you're all talking tosh, aren't you? Come on. I mean, this is just nonsense. So, I mean, every weekend now, well, not every weekend, so many weekends, London is completely disrupted because of people feeling that it's their right to go onto the streets to complain about what's going on.
Well, it is their right.
Well, yeah, absolutely. They're totally and utterly disrupting everybody else's life.
So you want to ban all marches?
No, I think they need to be done in a correct way. They need to have a correct route. They need to have a correct start. Yeah, but they don't, because then they go on the tubes and they start the chanting on the tube.
How dare they?
But if you're a Jewish person and you're out,
that's a different question.
No. This is all part of it.
No, it's not.
Of course it is.
No,
of course it is.
Not
you
really.
tell that to those people that won't want to go out.
Are they fare dodging in the tubes? Do you think they're fare dodging as well? I'm just wondering how many things you're going to accuse these poor demonstrators of doing.
Mr. Khan is not doing very well collecting money, but that's nothing to do with this.
Re-elected against your advice.
You wonder who votes.
And of course, Heather, you'll find Jews march alongside Palestinian people in these marches.
I really don't want to go down that road.
No, I know.
We haven't got too long on this.
I think there needs to be a proportionate area. So, I mean, I don't mind if it's Westminster Square. And if they set up on Westminster Square, they have 2 hours on Westminster Square, and they do whatever they do.
Parliament Square?
Parliament Square. I mean, that's the home of democracy.
Right.
That would be perfectly all right.
Trying to stop them going there.
No. But my point is there and only there.
Alex
and
Salmond.
not disrupting the rest
I'm
of
just going to point out that our previous Prime Minister, Tony Blair, wanted to ban demonstrations in Parliament Square because of a one-person demonstration against him.
Yes.
Actually introduced legislation because one man was protesting against him for years and years, and very effectively, in my opinion. Yeah. Now, who is John Woodcock to tell us? Baron Wolney, who brown-nosed his way into the House of Lords to lecture the rest of us in democracy. He's there because he pleased the Conservative government by deserting the Labour Party, so got himself into the House of Lords, and now he's going to tell the rest of us about democracy. It is an inherent right of a liberal democracy for people to demonstrate.
That's fine.
Yes, it can, yes, it can
no.
be, yes, it can
So
be inconvenient.
that ambulance gets stuck on the bridge.
Yes,
that ambulance gets stuck up Blackpool
no,
Tunnel.
yes,
It's not acceptable.
Yes, it can be inconvenient, but that is
That's
the
not
price you pay
inconvenient,
for
that's
a
people
democratic
dying.
society. And the alternative is a lot worse.
Heather,
a lot
today,
worse.
I heard Michael Gove say that people should pay for the policing of their own demonstrations. What does that do to the poor in this country?
Well, if you go to a football match, there's
Exactly.
30,000 people there. You pay for the football match. You pay for the police there.
That was his
No, they don't actually.
illustration.
The taxpayer does.
Well, not
by and large.
He said that
you have to pay for the private security.
His point was that Chelsea Football Club pay for the policing of their own matches. But what about the poor? What about the dispossessed? What about the homeless? What about the people living in damp flats? What about the people all over this country who feel they have no voice? And as I think the caller David said, have waited for justice from Parliament and it doesn't come, or it takes 40 years. What should they do? Just sit there and wait?
They shouldn't be sitting in a damp flat. They should be getting hold of their council. They should be getting hold of their social housing thing.
Your government has starved local authorities of the funding that they need to be able to go and do
The
that.
HRA account has never been stronger.
If you speak over each other, people listening cannot understand who's
But at least we
speaking.
weren't coughing.
Well, we weren't coughing.
Doing our best.
One or two people have expressed concern about Heather and and indeed Alex's coughs.
As well,
we
yes,
do
I-
apologise.
Yeah.
But we have a mixture of afflictions.
I'm
don't
just
we?
saying to Heather that it should be as well not to be too hard on oppressed minorities, because the Conservative Party are
It's about to become one.
Yeah.
Well, on that controversial note, we're going to move on to. If you think that exchange was feisty, just wait for the next one. It's 8:31 on LBC. Let's get the news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
An aviation expert has told LBC there is little the pilot could have done to prevent sudden severe turbulence on a flight from London to Singapore. A British man's died during after likely suffering a heart attack. A man accused of assisting the Hong Kong intelligence service has died in unexplained circumstances in a park in Berkshire. 37-year-old Matthew Trickett was found dead in Maidenhead on Sunday. Police say their investigation is ongoing. And compensation payments of more than £2 million could be handed out to victims of the infected blood scandal. The government has published preliminary figures on its website. LBC weather: heavy rain for eastern, central and northern England tonight, as well as parts of Wales and southern Scotland. A low of 7 degrees.
This is LBC. Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:34 on LBC. Alex Salmond, Heather Wheeler, Steve Chalke and Caroline Lucas are with us. Now, Caroline, you have got a best-selling book, which you have failed to bring along to brandish in front of our cameras.
I know.
What's it called and what's it about?
Well, the big thing was that it stayed in that bestseller list longer than Liz Truss's book, so that's all you really need to know. But,
must be good.
It's called Another England, and I do apologise to Penguin, for whom I did not remember to bring the book along. Another England, How to Reclaim Our National Story.
Wow.
And essentially the premise of the book is that if we're not careful, the right will basically hijack the story of England being one of ever-increasing exceptionalism, of imperial nostalgia, and that the left, as a whole, need to get much better at telling compelling stories. We tend to shy away from stories, and we're certainly squeamish about talking about England at all. It feels to me we need to get better at telling compelling stories, and we need to be better at recognising a much more radical heritage for England than we currently do.
Why just England, though? Because I can feel Alex twitching.
Yeah, no, let me tell you why.
On the contrary.
I will tell you why, because I don't think it is unreasonable to expect that within the next 10 or 15 years, Scotland will become independent. I think it's not unreasonable to expect that in Ireland we could have that referendum under the Sinn Féin First Minister and the island of Ireland could reunite. In Wales, that might take a bit longer, but even in Wales there is a process whereby nationalism and independence is on the table as an option, which could leave England on its own. And it feels to me that we need to get better at telling a more compelling story about England, going back to some of the more radical traditions of the diggers and the levellers and the protests against enclosures
Here's what
and
we
so on.
prepared earlier.
Oh,
It's
my
just
God.
arrived. There it
You
is.
hold it up
Okay,
the right
I'm
way.
getting it the right way up.
Hey.
Thank you very much. And so it's
I
a
think
great
it's
read.
Andrew Marr's copy. Right.
Thank
Well,
you.
we'd love to talk longer about it. In fact, I might get you on my podcast to talk longer about
Perfect,
it at
thank
some
you.
point in the future. Steve has done my podcast recently, All Talk, and you enjoyed the experience.
It was a great conversation. I've also published a book recently. I've written 40 books.
40?
Written.
40?
Yeah. And,
Too much time on your hands.
No, I've written
At least
these across
collected
the
sermons. Or...
No. The last one is called A Manifesto for Hope, and it's about why we need to re-engage the voluntary sector in creating the England, the Britain, the British Isles that we need.
You better
Because we've
stop
locked
there,
them out,
because
we
I'll have
left
to
it
ask Alex if he wants to plug a
statutory
book.
agencies, and we need to invite local charities and local
Okay.
people back in, and it's
Right.
about that.
We've
Manifesto for
we've
Hope.
got a very important question coming up from Khalid in Leicester. Hello, Khalid.
Hi, Ian. Yes, question I have. Is it possible that once the panel responds to my question, is it possible for me to react with one sentence after that?
We'll see how we're doing for time.
Yeah. Okay. So my question is that, look, now it appears that the ICC is going to issue arrest warrants for Netanyahu, for Gallant, and the Hamas leaders. Surely, after having seen the atrocities that is going on in Gaza, with the mass graves, with the displacement of people, with the eradication of many people, and the maiming, the displacing, the pregnant mothers, 180 women giving birth every day without anesthesia, etc. There's so much going on. Surely by now the UK government should back away from, which may possibly, the ICC suggestion is that they may be the Gallant and Netanyahu and other ministers. This opens a door for maybe accusing them or even indicting them for other crimes.
Okay, what's the question, Khalid? Because you're not going to get much time at the end if you keep going.
So basically, surely we should back away from possible war criminals, which may be shown in the future.
Okay. And now at this point, the arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant have only been requested, not granted. Now, Alex, you have a bit of form on this subject, don't you, in terms of the ICC and the ICJ, because you're trying to get Tony Blair indicted.
Well, that's right. I mean, for being responsible for the deaths of up to 1 million people, I thought that was an excellent idea, and I tried to get him impeached, of course, in the Westminster Parliament. A vote that finally only failed by, I think, 27, which was remarkable given the extent representing the Labour's majority at the time. But, I mean, this is a hugely important thing now. There's two different courts. There's the International Court of Justice, which proceeds against states and the illegality of states. And there's a case, obviously, against Israel at the present moment, taken forward by South Africa. And this court, the International Criminal Court, which the prosecutor, Karim Khan, has applied to the judges in the court for warrants for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu, the most inappropriately named defence minister of all time, Gallant, and the three Hamas operatives as well. And I have to say, I watched Karim Khan yesterday, and I was cheering from my chair that finally somebody was coming forward with a stated case, courageously stated, convincingly stated, and I mean the signatories to the Rome Convention, which governs this court, I think it was 126 countries around the world, should be immediately falling behind, assuming that the application for the warrant is granted. And I would say tonight, I would hope that the First Minister of Scotland and the Lord Advocate would make it clear that if any of these five gentlemen, if I can call them that, have the unwisdom to visit Scotland anytime soon, they should be arrested and handed over to the court. That should be all of the applicants to the all of the people who've signed the Rome Convention should follow that course.
Well, they're legally obliged to do so.
Legally obliged to do so. And the question that was asked by the questioner was about arms sales. You know, are you becoming aiding and abetting? And certainly,
it wasn't actually about arms sales. It was whether the UK government should be moving away from supporting possible war criminals.
Well, okay. Well, I'll specify it onto arms sales, because if the ICJ rules against Israel and the South African thing, then there would be an argument that you cannot supply arms to people who are held to be outside international law. And the last thing I'm going to say is this. I'm not plugging a book, but plugging an interview I gave recently with the rector of Glasgow University, Dr. Adam Sitter, and he was describing to me in full detail of how he, as a volunteer medic in Gaza just before Christmas, was operating without anaesthetic on amputations of children, but also without anaesthetic on patients with white phosphorus burns. White phosphorus is an illegal weapon of war. There is no question. He's presented that evidence to The Hague in January. I've just commended, it's on Turkish Tea Talk, where people would watch that interview and see if they are convinced by that first-hand evidence of illegality. And no one can watch that and say that we should be in any way aiding and abetting illegality on this mass scale, which has resulted in the murder of at least 25,000 innocent women and children.
I love the way that Scottish people say that word, murder.
Well, it's a bit Taggart, but this is actually happening.
Steve Chalke.
Taggart was fiction.
In my view, the slaughter of innocent people, whether they're Jewish or Palestinian, whether they're Jewish or Muslim, is still a crime. And I agree with everything that's been said. I sit at home and watch the news at 10 or whatever, and I just sit there and cry for those children, for those mothers, for those fathers, tens of thousands of people whose lives have been torn apart. Obviously, the torture, the humiliation and the murder of Hamas is a crime, but what we watch on our TVs every day is, in my view, as much a crime. I'm not a lawyer, but
I've got to ask the three of you to stick to the question, because we haven't got long on this before we have to go on to another one. So if you can answer Carly's question, whether the UK government should be moving away from supporting possible war criminals.
Of course. My daughter, one of my daughters, has been on those marches through London each week. Not because she's violent, she's far from it. She runs a charity, but because we have to, as a country, stop sending the ammunition to a state that we know are using those weapons to kill the innocent.
We should point out the British government doesn't actually sell any weapons to Israel.
Hooray.
It's private sector companies. They have export licenses, you're absolutely right, but it is actually factually wrong to say it's the British government.
But the British government could stop it happening, couldn't they? And that is the big issue.
And that's what I mean.
Okay, well, it's good that we've had the clarification because it's very easy to run away with ourselves on this. I actually find it really objectionable that a Hamas leader can be equated with a democratically elected leader of Israel. I find that absolutely disgusting. And I think Israel have absolutely got the right to defend themselves. And, we all wish we weren't in this position. Of course we do. But they've got the right to defend themselves.
Well, yes, but, I mean... The ICC is responsible for requesting warrants if they feel somebody has committed war crimes. Now, you and I would definitely agree that Hamas would have done that. Mm-hmm. Now, we might disagree that Israel has done that, but the court believes there's a question to answer and has requested the arrest warrants. If we believe in international law, if we believe in international humanitarian law, then who are we to question that?
Well, I just don't think it should have been brought in the first place. I really don't.
You can't pick and choose which bit of international law you want to uphold. Otherwise, that way, total chaos lies.
I think we've been doing that for a while.
One at a time, Caroline. No,
the irony of South Africa bringing this...
Heather, please respect. We have to have one at a time because listeners can't tell who's talking.
Okay, so what I wanted to say was that I do think that we should uphold international law, and therefore I do think that we should listen to what the ICC has said. But I would also say that, in a sense, we didn't need to wait for their verdict to know that already I think it's very clear that Israel is breaking international humanitarian law. They are stopping aid getting into civilians, and there is certainly evidence that they are targeting civilians, or at least civilians are inevitably in their way. And certainly if they go into Rafah...
That would be in any war, wouldn't it? I mean, there are always going to be civilian casualties in any war.
But I think when you've got a place that is so densely populated as Gaza, there is absolutely no way you can even imagine that you could be fighting Hamas without targeting civilians in the same place. So it does seem to me that we can dance on a pin, on the head of a pin about whether or not it's licensing arms exports, which it is. It's the licensing, not literally the UK government sending arms. But to the extent that it is a decision of this government as to whether or not those arms should be sold to Israel, then it's totally clear to me that this government should stop allowing those arms to be sold. And if they don't, it makes all of us complicit in breaking international law.
Khalid, I would like to come back to you, but we have run out of time, I'm afraid. But thank you very much for that question, which has inspired quite a feisty debate, which I knew it would. It's 8:47.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Caroline Lucas, Alex Salmond, Heather Wheeler and Steve Chalke with us answering your questions. Now, here's a cheeky one from JC in Blackheath. As Iain Dale is pretty much redundant on this issue of Cross Question, which boot camp should he be sent to? Now, I think he's referring to the fact that the government is set to offer skills boot camps in an attempt to get people on benefits back into work and to fill job roles previously held by foreign workers. Heather Wheeler.
Yep. Okay. So about you or about boot camps?
I think boot camps in general.
In general. Okay. So one of the things that I remember particularly when we had the shortage of HGV drivers, in effect, this is the baby of that idea, and so we set up training camps all over the country for people because it costs about £2,500 to train to be an HGV driver, and if you're unemployed, finding £2,500 is not easy. So the government stepped in, and it became an absolutely massive hit, a massive hit. So I'm all in favour of it.
Caroline?
Well, I think the language around boot camps is just insulting, to be honest, and it's particularly insulting coming from a government.
Insulting?
Because it
Simon
kind of
Cowell
gives...
uses them all the time.
Because it gives the impression to me, at least, that it's somehow something that people have to be forced to go and do. And this is a government, of course, that has cut skills training. It's cut the nurses' bursary. It's reduced annual increases in NHS funding. And these are problems of its own making. And so to kind of give the impression, which I think the overall package does, that this is about trying to push work-shy people into finding work, I think is insulting. A lot of those people are not working because they are on the NHS waiting lists trying to get treated, and under this government they're finding that increasingly difficult, or they need training, which again this government is not providing them with. So I think rather than just using what I still think is pretty insulting language, I would rather the government actually increase the skills funding in the first place.
Alex?
Well, there actually is a very effective skills and apprenticeship programme. It's just it's underfunded and it's well understaffed. There's not nearly enough people go through it, so why don't you just invest in apprenticeships and the skill training and the ability to move up through the qualifications, which is the principle and theory behind it, instead of ideas which are thrown out for approaching elections and we'll set up camps here and there and all the rest of it. Just invest in the established skills procedures and it will reinforce the ability and skills of the economy.
I don't know whether you guys live in a completely different world to me, but in South Derbyshire we've got more people than ever going into apprenticeships. We've got more people than ever going into work. We've got more women than ever going into work. Do you guys live in a different world to me?
Why are you needing the boot camps?
Yeah.
What I'm talking about was the HGV was a classic example. We needed to do that kickstart to get people to want to do that. And when they found that they were earning $50,000 a year, they were very happy, thank you.
A very rude texter is saying, can this right-winger, that's you, Heather, retrain as a HGV driver or fruit picker?
Well,
you might need to after November.
Yeah, I'm not very good at fruit picking.
Can I say,
Steve?
I'm committed to the carrot, not the stick. I'm committed to a society that inspires people rather than puts them down. And to your point, Heather, in our schools across the country, working in socio-economically deprived communities, we have around 35,000 children at this moment who we educated today and every day, and we work with their families, their parents, their grandparents, and I know that when you inspire people instead of beat them up, you get a lot
How
further.
is beating up somebody to go to a place to learn how to become an HGV driver?
Boot camp.
Don't you think that they mean the sort of Simon Cowell type of boot camp rather than an army barracks?
Call it an apprenticeship, but tell her there's some things wrong with the apprenticeship programme, as I know that you know. So how many people start apprenticeships? How many people complete them? We got to upskill people through apprenticeships.
You really want to go and have a look at the Nuclear Academy apprenticeship at Rolls-Royce? It is out of this world.
We are an apprenticeship provider.
Brilliant.
I'm a registered apprenticeship provider.
Very good.
So I know a little bit more about apprenticeships than you might think, because everybody writes preachers off as people who preach sermons. Actually, what I'm out there doing is working with people to bring about a better society.
It's right. The gospel.
Talking of Gospels, that's the subject of our next question. Andy in Falkirk says, fewer than half of people in Scotland are religious now. Why do we still let the church have such a big say over how the country is run. Reverend Steve Chalke.
Well, I would say, tragically, hands up, both hands up, the church has not always lived up to its name, and religion has become, in many people's eyes, something that quite poisonous. It's scared them, it's persecuted them, it's traumatised them for all sorts of reasons. But the word religion is Latin. It comes from a Latin word, same word as ligament. Ligament is the thing that creates connection, and religion or spirituality at its core is about reconnecting us as society, connecting yourself to yourself, yourself to others, and yourself to God. And I would say this, in all our community work again, for all the houses and the education and the jobs and apprenticeships that we provide, what also needs to go on in somebody's life is a new inner story. All the time they own a story that I'm no good, I don't fit, I'm too slow, I'm too thick, they don't get anywhere. And spirituality addresses that inner voice and that inner story. So let's not despise spirituality. It's part of who we are.
Well, in 2011, only 36.7% of Scots said that they had no religion. That's up to 51.1% now. The SNP has been in power during all of this period, Alex. I mean, you were in power for some of it. You've become a nation of heathens.
Well, I have to say that, I've got some criticisms of the SNP over the last 10 years. As you know, Iain, less so before that, obviously. but I don't think it was the job of the SNP government over the last 10 years to sustain the religious...
No, indeed, but that's quite a substantial rise,
isn't it? I should say, instead, there are health warnings with that census, because for the first time in 200 years, a minister called Angus Robertson was so incompetent he couldn't actually run the census. The first time in 2021.
He's got another problem at the moment, hasn't he?
Well, his department has given £100,000 to a porn movie in the Highlands, which he's now demanding answers to. Actually, it's quite interesting. Ministers are meant to be answering questions like that, not demanding answers from their own department. We'll leave Angus Robertson to one side, which is the best place for him. And there's no question that the census does show a huge collapse, particularly in Church of Scotland affiliated support. Now, I think it's sad in a way, because there is a great deal to be said for societies where people have a faith, whatever faith that is. I think it sustains people through times of crisis. I do, and that's not the only reason it's sad. I was going to say, this pandemic, every major pandemic or world event through the last 2,000 years, whether it be the millennium or the Black Death, tended to result in a huge increase in religious fervour. In the Western world, at least, this pandemic has been the exception to every other serious global health problem, which has previously resulted in movement to religion for pretty understandable reasons. As they used to say, there's no atheists in the trenches. But that, according to these census figures, whatever the health warning has them, that's a very unusual factor, and the established churches should be looking to their laurels as to why this is the case.
Heather?
I think that census is very sad. Everybody knows that when we start in the chamber in the House of Commons, the first 5 minutes we have a Church of England service. You don't have to be religious, you can go in. It's the only 5 minutes piece I get all day, and it's really uplifting for me, and it keeps me going. And so as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter whether you do 5 minutes church or an hour on Sunday or whatever it is, as long as you believe in something, then that keeps you going.
Well, that's exactly what's wrong in my view. To have that ritual of people getting the seat, I gave up on that when Princess Diana was actually, when she was moved out of the royal family, was dropped from the ritual prayers. Actually, that was a time probably where she needed people praying for her the most, but because of this ritual, but it's near blasphemy in my view to have religion used in that fashion. I would commend the Scottish Parliament, albeit the census tells us it's not working, but the talk that's given before each session of the Scottish Parliament from people of all faiths, and indeed humanists as well, is a much better example of all.
Well, I agree with Alex about that last point. I would like, I do go into the House of Commons for that 5 minutes, because I quite like the stillness of it as well.
It's lovely.
But I don't think it should just be Church of England. I think we should have all different kinds of ways of coming together and having those
Which is the
moments
official
of stillness.
religion of the country, isn't it?
Yes, but as your census is just telling us, it's not necessarily particularly representative. And I guess what I would be interested in, and I don't know if the census asked the question, would be how many people do feel spiritual in some sense, in the kind of ways that Stephen was talking about, because it could well be that while fewer people are necessarily associating with the Church of England, they might be associating with a broader definition of spirituality.
Well, we are going to continue the discussion on this question after 9 o'clock, so I'd welcome your views on it too. Now, our final question, our fun question, is from Jennifer in Horsham. Hundreds of iconic props from Hollywood movies are going up for auction, including the Ark of the Covenant from the first Indiana Jones film and the multicoloured dance floor from Saturday Night Fever. If you were given the funds to buy one legendary film prop, which would it be? I'll kick off by saying the mothership in Independence Day. Steve?
It would be the DeLorean from Back to the Future. I mean, you've got one of those. You can go anywhere, anytime, change anything. Vote for the DeLorean. Change your mind, Ian.
You know, DeLorean was a distinguished-looking gentleman, just like Steve is, of course, and he was given millions of pounds by Eric Varley, and where it went, God only knows. But they used to say about that whole episode, how green was my Varley.
He was the Labour Industry Minister at the time. Heather?
Well, I really am going to answer the question properly, because I would love that multicoloured dance floor, but I've just had new carpets put down and I'm not going through all that again. So I'm going to go with the Maltese Falcon. That's what I'm going to have.
Oh, yes, that's
why
great.
not?
Really good film.
Caroline?
Fantastic idea.
Well, I really struggled with this because my guilty secret is my favourite films are all kind of rom-coms, you know, they're things like Madly, Deeply, or Four Weddings and a Funeral, or Love Actually, and I'm really struggling to think what the iconic thing would be from them.
So much less of you now.
But I know. I'm thinking about it. But then I thought, Green Card. Do you remember that film,
Yes,
Green Card? Okay.
I do.
So I know it's cheating slightly, but the Andie MacDowell character creates that amazing garden in the flat, which is why she's marrying Gerard Depardieu in order to get the flat. So I'd like that green garden, please.
It's a great film. Can I have Rick's Bar in Casablanca?
Yeah. I was going to go with the piano.
To while away my winter
That's
evenings.
good.
Absolutely.
Final word goes to Caroline Lucas, or her book, Another England, it is called. It's worth a read, do buy it, and I'll interview Caroline about it in much more detail in the next couple of months, I hope.
Thank you.
Coming up in the next hour, we are going to return to that subject of why Scotland has become so irreligious. Does such a word exist? I think it does, doesn't it? Because a total of 51.1% of Scots responded no religion in Scotland's census in 2022, up from 36.7% in 2011. Now, there has to be a reason for this, and I suspect, actually, it's probably the same in England and Wales, possibly not Northern Ireland, I don't know, but you tell me. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. Why do increasingly few people believe in a higher power? Well, that coming up next here on LBC with me, Iain Dale.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, a 73-year-old man has died in severe turbulence during a flight from